Right now, somewhere above you, hidden in the clouds at 30,000 feet, there is a plane circling in silence. No flight plan filed with the public. No passengers. No commercial purpose. Just a machine and a crew of 22 people carrying a weight that no human being should ever have to carry. The authority to end the world as we know it. And it has been up there in some form every single day, every single hour for more than 6 decades. You have never heard it. You have never seen it. But it has been watching. It has been waiting. And if the worst day in human history ever arrives, this plane will be the last voice of American civilization. This is the story of the Looking Glass. And once you understand what it is, what it does, and why it exists, you will never look up at the sky the same way again. Before we go any further, I want you to stop for a moment and think about something. Think about the most terrifying problem that a military strategist in the 1950s could possibly face. You have nuclear weapons. Your enemy has nuclear weapons. Both sides have enough firepower to destroy every city on the planet multiple times over. But here is the problem that keeps generals awake at night. What happens if the enemy fires first? What happens if, in a single blinding flash, the cities where your leaders sit, the bunkers where your generals work, the underground command centers where the launch codes are stored? What happens if all of that disappears in a matter of minutes? What happens to your weapons? What happens to your submarines lurking deep in the ocean, waiting for orders that will never come? What happens to your missile crews sitting in their underground silos, staring at a phone that has gone dead forever? You have weapons, but without a command, without a voice, without a surviving authority to give the order, those weapons are useless. And an enemy who understands this knows that the most effective first strike is not necessarily the one that destroys your weapons. It is the one that destroys your ability to command them. This is called decapitation. And in the early years of the Cold War, American military planners realized with cold, horrifying clarity that the entire nuclear deterrent of the United States, every missile, every submarine, every bomber, was only as powerful as the human beings who could order them to fire. Kill the commanders, and you kill the deterrent. Kill the deterrent, and you give the Soviet Union a window to strike without consequence. The solution that emerged from this terrifying problem was one of the most extraordinary ideas in the history of military aviation. If the command centers on the ground could be destroyed, then the command center itself had to leave the ground. It had to take to the sky, where no missile could reach it in time, where no strike could silence it, where it could circle endlessly above the clouds and maintain an unbroken chain of authority no matter what happened below. They called this plane the Looking Glass, and the name is deliberate and deeply meaningful. A looking glass is a mirror, and that is exactly what this aircraft was designed to be. A perfect aerial mirror of everything that happened underground. A floating reflection of the command and control infrastructure of the United States nuclear arsenal, ready to take over the moment the original went dark. Let us go back to the beginning. The year is 1959. The Cold War is at its most dangerous and most terrifying peak. The Soviet Union has tested its first intercontinental ballistic missile. That means for the first time in history, a weapon launched from Soviet soil can reach American soil in less than 30 minutes. The window of warning has collapsed. The margin for error has essentially disappeared. And the Strategic Air Command, the most powerful military organization in the world at that moment, is deeply troubled by a question it cannot answer. If a Soviet first strike comes in the early morning hours with no warning, and the underground command post at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska is destroyed in the first wave of strikes, who gives the orders? Who commands the bombers? Who authorizes the launch of the missiles? Who tells the submarines in the Atlantic and Pacific what to do? The answer, proposed by military planners with the quiet confidence of people who have stared into the abyss, is this. an airplane. A specially modified airplane, always airborne, always manned by a general officer with full nuclear authority, always capable of communicating with every element of the American nuclear triad. An airplane that never lands. An airplane that refuels in the air. An airplane that circles day and night, week after week, year after year, ready for a call it hopes will never come. In 1960, the first tests began. They took a Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker, a military tanker aircraft derived from the same basic airframe as the famous Boeing 707, and they converted it into something extraordinary. They stripped out the fuel tanks and replaced them with communications equipment. They installed radios and encryption systems and launch control panels. They built a battle staff area where military officers could sit, think, plan, and, if necessary, command the launch of nuclear weapons from the air. They called the result the EC-135C. And on February 3, 1961, one of these aircraft lifted off from Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, climbed to altitude, and began circling over the American heartland. That flight never really ended. Not for 29 years. From February 3, 1961 to July 24, 1990, there was always at least one EC-135C looking glass aircraft airborne somewhere over the central United States. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, through blizzards and heat waves, through political crises and presidential inaugurations, through the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War, through Watergate and the Iranian hostage crisis, through every tense moment of the Cold War and every quiet, peaceful night that followed. The plane never stopped flying. The crew never stopped watching. The general on board never stopped waiting for a call that, thankfully, mercifully, never came. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Over those 29 years, the Looking Glass aircraft accumulated more than 281,000 accident-free flying hours. That is not a typo. 281,000 hours in the air, without a single accident, without a single catastrophic failure, without a single moment when the chain of command was broken. It is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary operational achievements in the history of military aviation. Now, let's talk about what the Looking Glass actually did. What was happening inside that aircraft as it circled above America's farms and suburbs and cities? Because understanding the inside of the Looking Glass is understanding the mechanics of nuclear deterrence at its most intimate and most terrifying level. The crew of the EC-135C Looking Glass was composed of approximately 24 people, each one with a very specific role. At the top of the hierarchy sat the most important person on the aircraft, a flag officer. That means a general or an admiral, not a colonel, not a senior captain, a general, a person with stars on their shoulders and the full weight of military authority behind them. This person held the title of Airborne Emergency Action Officer, and they carried a responsibility that is almost impossible to put into words. Under certain conditions, specifically if the ground-based command centers were destroyed and communication with the National Command Authority, meaning the President and Secretary of Defense, was lost, the Airborne Emergency Action Officer was authorized by law to assume the authority of the National Command Authority. That means a general sitting in a converted airplane above Nebraska could, under the right circumstances, command the launch of America's entire nuclear arsenal. Not by choice, not by ambition, but by a cold, rational, terrifying legal framework designed to ensure that even if Washington was ash and rubble, the deterrent would still function. Supporting this general was a battle staff of approximately 20 people. Each one had a defined role that read like a checklist for the end of the world. There was the mission commander, who directed the overall operation of the aircraft and its mission. There was the strike advisor, an expert in nuclear war plans who advised the general on what options were available and what their consequences would be. There was the airborne launch control system officer, whose specific job was to operate the equipment that could reach directly into the underground missile silos and command the Minuteman ICBMs to fire. There was the force status controller, whose job was to track in real time every strategic nuclear weapon in the American inventory, every submarine, every bomber, every missile silo, and know at any given moment what was ready, what was operational, and what had potentially been destroyed. There was the Emergency Actions NCO, a non-commissioned officer whose encyclopedic knowledge of emergency action procedures and message formats was the operational glue that held everything together in a crisis. And there was the Meteorological Effects Officer, who sounds almost out of place in this apocalyptic setting, but whose job was genuinely critical. Calculating the effects of nuclear explosions on weather patterns and communications. Because in a post-strike environment, the physics of nuclear detonations would dramatically affect the ability of aircraft and missiles to communicate. And then there were the communications systems operators. Because communication, more than anything else, was the entire point of the looking glass. An airborne command post is useless if it cannot talk to the forces it is trying to command. And the challenge of communicating in a nuclear environment is more complex and more frightening than most people ever think about. Consider this. A nuclear detonation does not just destroy buildings and kill people. It also releases an enormous electromagnetic pulse, the EMP, that can disable electronic equipment across a vast area. It generates intense radiation that disrupts radio communications. It creates a superheated plasma in the upper atmosphere that can block certain radio frequencies for minutes or hours. The nuclear battlefield is also an electronic battlefield, and surviving in it requires communication systems that can cut through all of that interference and still get a message delivered. The Looking Glass was equipped with an extraordinary array of communication systems designed to work in exactly these conditions. High-frequency radio, ultra-high-frequency radio, super high-frequency satellite communications, and most remarkably of all, a very low-frequency transmitter system that used a 5-mile-long trailing wire antenna that could be reeled out from the rear of the aircraft. Very low-frequency signals, because of their extremely long wavelengths, can penetrate seawater to a depth sufficient to reach submerged submarines. That trailing wire antenna was literally the lifeline between the Looking Glass and the ballistic missile submarines that formed a critical part of America's nuclear deterrent, submarines that might be hundreds of feet beneath the surface of the Atlantic or Pacific, waiting silently in the dark for a message that they hoped would never come. There's a detail here that I want to dwell on for a moment, because it is one of those details that captures the genuine human strangeness of living with nuclear deterrence. The pilots of the Looking Glass, at high alert levels, specifically at DEFCON 2 or above, were required to wear an eye patch when they were at the controls of the aircraft. Not both eyes. One eye. A single eye patch covering one eye. The reason is this. If a nuclear detonation occurs in the vicinity of the aircraft, the flash of the explosion is bright enough to instantly and permanently blind any eyes that are exposed to it. By keeping one eye covered, one pilot would retain functional vision even after a nearby nuclear blast. They could fly the aircraft. They could continue the mission. It is a small detail, but it tells you everything about the mindset of the people who designed this system. They thought about everything. They planned for every contingency, even the contingency of nuclear blindness. The aircraft was also hardened against electromagnetic pulse effects. Its electronics were shielded. Its systems were designed to continue functioning in a radiation environment that would disable ordinary aircraft. It was in every practical sense built to survive the beginning of the end of the world and keep working. Now let us talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, because this is the moment when the looking glass went from being a theoretical insurance policy to a real operational necessity. In those 13 days in October, when President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev stood on the edge of nuclear war and stared into the abyss together, the looking glass was there. It was airborne. Its general was watching. Its communications systems were humming. And the people aboard it understood, with a clarity that no one else in the world outside of the highest levels of government shared, just how close everything was. Soviet nuclear missiles had been secretly installed in Cuba, less than 90 miles from the coast of Florida. They were capable of striking Washington, D.C. in minutes. American strategic bombers were placed on airborne alert. The entire nuclear machinery of both superpowers was wound tight, coiled like a spring, waiting for a trigger that almost came. During those 13 days, additional looking glass aircraft were held on ground alert, ready to scramble within minutes. The crews briefed and rebriefed their emergency action procedures. The generals reviewed the war plans. And in the end, diplomacy won. The missiles were removed. The aircraft stood down. The world exhaled. But the looking glass kept flying. Because the lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was not that the danger had passed. The lesson was that the danger was permanent. That in a world of nuclear weapons and ideological conflict, the possibility of catastrophe never goes away. It only goes dormant, waiting. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the looking glass program expanded and evolved. Additional aircraft were added to the post-attack command control system, which planners called PACCS, pronounced PACS. This system created a chain of airborne command posts stretching from Washington all the way across the country, with relay aircraft positioned to ensure that a message from a surviving looking glass could reach missile fields in Wyoming, North Dakota, Montana, and every other state where Minuteman ICBMs waited in their underground silos. The system was designed so that even if every ground-based command center was destroyed, a signal from an airborne platform could still reach the missiles and the submarines and the bombers. The chain of command would survive. During this period, a detail emerged that says something profound about the dedication of the people involved in this mission. The crews of the looking glass aircraft rotated regularly, as any military crew would. They flew 8-hour shifts, sometimes longer, before being relieved by another crew. But here is what strikes you when you read the accounts of the people who flew these missions. They took it seriously in a way that is almost impossible to understand from the outside. These were not people going through the motions. These were not bureaucrats performing a routine. These were military officers who genuinely believed that the mission they were flying was the last line of defense between civilization and catastrophe. Every flight, every checklist, every communications check was performed with the understanding that this might be the day the call came. And they were ready. They were always ready. Then came 1990. The Berlin Wall had fallen in November 1989. The Soviet Union was visibly crumbling. The threat that had defined American military planning for 4 decades was dissolving before the world's eyes. And on July 24th, 1990, the Looking Glass made its last continuous airborne flight. After 29 years, for months, and 21 days of uninterrupted airborne alert, the aircraft landed. The mission did not end. Aircraft remained on ground alert, ready to launch within minutes. But the continuous flying, the endless circling, the never-landing vigil that had defined the Cold War in the most literal possible sense came to a close. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary moment. The Los Angeles Times ran a headline: Doomsday planes round-the-clock flights called off. People who had spent careers managing and flying the Looking Glass stood at Offutt Air Force Base and watched the last continuous flight come to an end. Some of them felt relief. Some of them felt a kind of grief. The grief of people who had dedicated years of their lives to a mission that the world was now perhaps outgrowing. And some of them felt a quiet, cautious hope that this particular chapter of human history was finally over. It was not over. In 1992, the Strategic Air Command was dissolved and replaced by the United States Strategic Command. The nuclear mission reorganized and reconsolidated, and it became clear that the Looking Glass mission, however modified, would need to continue. The world had changed, but nuclear weapons had not disappeared. New threats were emerging. The geopolitical landscape was shifting in unpredictable ways. And the fundamental logic that had created the Looking Glass in the first place, the logic that said a survivable airborne command post is an essential element of a credible nuclear deterrent, remained as valid as it had ever been. So in 1990s, a new aircraft entered the Looking Glass story, the Boeing E-6B Mercury. And this is where the Navy enters a mission that had been owned by the Air Force since 1961. The E-6A Mercury had already been in service since 1989, performing a mission called TACAMO, which stands for Take Charge and Move Out. The TACAMO mission was specifically designed to communicate with ballistic missile submarines. Those submarines, the Ohio-class boats carrying Trident missiles, represent 1/3 of America's nuclear triad and perhaps the most survivable element of it. A submarine hiding in the depths of the ocean is essentially immune to a first strike, but it is only a deterrent if it can receive orders. And communicating with a submerged submarine is one of the most technically challenging problems in military communications. The solution involves very low-frequency radio waves. VLF waves can penetrate seawater to a meaningful depth, allowing a signal to reach a submarine that does not need to surface or even come close to the surface to receive it. The E-6A was designed to transmit these VLF signals using a remarkable trailing wire antenna, a wire that could be reeled out from the rear of the aircraft to a length of approximately 5 miles. 5 miles of wire trailing behind a jet aircraft, acting as a massive antenna, broadcasting orders to submarines hiding in the deep. The E-6B built on the E-6A by adding the command post functions of the Air Force's Looking Glass. The battle staff positions were added. The airborne launch control system was integrated. The E-6B became a dual-mission aircraft, capable of both the TACAMO submarine communication mission and the Looking Glass airborne command post mission. It could talk to the submarines. It could also command the land-based Minuteman missiles. And it could serve as the airborne alternative national command post if the ground-based infrastructure was destroyed. On October 1st, 1998, the E-6B Mercury officially assumed the Looking Glass mission from the aging EC-135 fleet. The aircraft that had protected the world for nearly 4 decades was retired. A new aircraft with new capabilities took its place. The mission continued without interruption. The E-6B is, by the standards of military aviation, a remarkable aircraft. It is derived from the Boeing 707 commercial airliner, the same basic design that revolutionized commercial air travel in the late 1950s. But what happens inside the E-6B has nothing to do with commercial aviation. The aircraft carries a battle staff of 22 people. It is equipped with a hardened communications suite designed to survive and operate in a nuclear environment. Its electronics are shielded against electromagnetic pulse. Its windows are designed to resist nuclear flash. The aircraft itself is capable of air-to-air refueling, allowing it to remain airborne for extraordinary lengths of time. Theoretically, the only limit on how long the E-6B can stay in the air is the endurance of its crew. The United States Navy operates a fleet of 16 E-6B aircraft. They are organized into two operational squadrons. The Ironmen of Fleet Air Reconnaissance Squadron 3, known as VQ-3, and the Shadows of Fleet Air Reconnaissance Squadron 4, known as VQ-4. Both squadrons deploy from their main operating base at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, with aircraft and crews also forward deployed to Travis Air Force Base in California, Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, and Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland, among other locations. The mission requirement is unambiguous. At any given moment, there must be at least one E-6B airborne and capable of performing the looking glass function. In practice, multiple aircraft are often airborne simultaneously. On certain days of heightened alert or training exercises, as many as 6 E-6B aircraft have been tracked airborne over the continental United States at the same time, each one a flying command post, each one carrying the weight of nuclear authority. Now let us talk about what happens inside the E-6B on a normal mission day, because there is something deeply striking about the idea that this extraordinary aircraft, doing this extraordinary job, has a normal mission day. The crew boards the aircraft hours before launch. Each person has a specific workstation with a specific set of equipment. The communications systems officers begin their system checks, verifying that every radio, every encryption system, every data link is functioning correctly. The battle staff officer reviews the day's emergency action procedures. The airborne emergency action officer, the admiral or general on board, is briefed on the current strategic situation, the current alert status of nuclear forces, and the current state of geopolitical tensions. The aircraft launches and climbs to its operating altitude, typically around 30,000 feet. The trailing wire antenna system is tested. Communications checks are made with submarines, with ground stations, with the satellite network. And then the aircraft circles for hours, watching, listening, ready. The crews who fly these missions speak about them with a particular kind of quiet pride. They are part of a mission that most of the world does not know exists. They carry a responsibility that cannot be discussed at dinner parties or explained to neighbors. They sit in an aircraft that circles in the sky day after day, and they know that what they're doing matters in a way that very few jobs in the world actually matter. Not because they want to use the power they carry, but because the fact that they carry it credibly and reliably is what makes it unnecessary. This is the paradox at the heart of nuclear deterrence, and it is the paradox that gives the Looking Glass mission its particular emotional weight. The entire point of the aircraft is to ensure that it never has to do its primary job. If the Looking Glass general ever actually has to give the order, if the trailing wire is ever actually used to send launch codes to submarines in a real nuclear exchange, then everything has already failed. The deterrent has failed. Diplomacy has failed. Human civilization is in the process of failing. The Looking Glass is the last resort of a system built entirely on the hope that the last resort will never be needed. And yet the crews take their mission with deadly seriousness. Because the alternative, a deterrent that is not credible, an airborne command post that might not work, a communication system that might fail in the moment of maximum crisis, would itself be a kind of catastrophic failure. An enemy who believes that the American command structure is vulnerable, that it can be decapitated in a first strike, that the nuclear deterrent might not function, is an enemy who might actually contemplate a first strike. The credibility of the deterrent depends on the reality of the Looking Glass. And the reality of the Looking Glass depends on the dedication of the people who fly it. Let us also take a moment to appreciate the technology inside the E-6B, because it is genuinely remarkable and deserves more attention than it typically receives. The aircraft's very low-frequency communication system is the heart of its submarine communication capability. VLF radio waves, operating at frequencies between 3 and 30 kilohertz, have the unusual property of being able to penetrate seawater. Not deeply. VLF signals typically reach submarines at depths of perhaps 20 to 40 meters below the surface, depending on conditions. But this is enough. A submarine does not need to come anywhere near the surface to receive a VLF signal. It can remain hidden, deep and invisible, and still receive its orders. The primary VLF antenna on the E-6B is that extraordinary trailing wire, a wire that, when fully deployed, stretches approximately 5 miles behind the aircraft. Think about what that looks like from a distance. A Boeing 707 derived aircraft, flying at altitude, trailing 5 miles of wire behind it like an enormous fishing line. The wire is weighted at the end to keep it roughly vertical below the aircraft, creating a powerful antenna capable of transmitting VLF signals over enormous distances. The system is so effective that a single E-6B can communicate with submarines operating across a vast area of ocean. The aircraft also carries an airborne launch control system, or ALCS, which is perhaps the most consequential piece of equipment on board. The ALCS is essentially a remote control system for America's land-based Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles. The ICBM silos scattered across the American Midwest, in Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and Colorado, are normally controlled by underground launch control centers manned by Air Force missile crews. But if those launch control centers are destroyed or incapacitated, the ALCS allows the E-6B to step in. The system allows the aircraft to determine the status of missiles in their silos, change their targeting assignments if necessary, and ultimately command them to launch. It is an extraordinary capability, a jet aircraft flying at altitude, with the ability to fire nuclear-armed ICBMs scattered across thousands of square miles of American heartland. The aircraft cannot drop a bomb or fire a gun, but can launch Minuteman missiles. It is a weapon system in the most profound and unusual sense of the phrase. The ALCS operates through ultra-high frequency radio systems, transmitting through the standard broadcast frequencies used by the Missile Forces Command and Control Network. The signal has to penetrate to the silos, deep underground, hardened against nuclear effects, and command them to open, arm, and launch. It is a technically demanding feat, and the E-6B's communication suite is designed to make it work even in the electromagnetic chaos of a nuclear exchange. Now, I want to talk about the human element of this mission, because behind all the hardware and the acronyms and the strategic concepts, there are real human beings living with an extraordinary reality. The crews of the E-6B, like the crews of the EC-135 before them, are a self-selected group. They volunteered for this work. They passed rigorous security screenings. They trained for months before their first operational mission, and they carry their responsibility with a gravity that is almost tangible. Consider what it means to be the Airborne Emergency Action Officer on a looking glass mission. You are a flag officer, an admiral or a general with decades of military service. You board an aircraft and you fly for hours. You do your paperwork. You review your briefings. You eat your meals. You exist, in most ways, like any other person on any other long flight. But in a corner of your mind, you are always aware that you are carrying something extraordinary. You are carrying the legal authority under specific circumstances to order the launch of nuclear weapons. Not because you want to, not because anyone wants you to, but because somebody has to, and because the entire architecture of nuclear deterrence is built on the certainty that if the worst happens, somebody capable and credible and properly authorized will be there to respond. The weight of that responsibility is something that former Looking Glass crew members speak about with a particular kind of quiet intensity. They are proud of their service. They are proud of the mission, but they're also profoundly aware of what the mission represents, of what it means to spend your career preparing for a job you hope desperately you will never have to do. There are stories from the Cold War era that give you a sense of what these flights felt like at their most tense. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Looking Glass crews were briefed on the actual state of nuclear readiness in a way that most military personnel were not. They knew, in real time, how close the situation was. They knew what the war plans called for. They knew that if the president gave the order, the chain of command ran directly through their aircraft. Some of them have spoken about sitting at their stations in those October days of 1962, watching their communications equipment, listening to the encrypted traffic, and understanding with absolute clarity that the world's survival was a genuinely open question. And they kept flying. They kept doing their jobs, because that is what the mission required. The E-6B Mercury has also operated in situations that, while not full nuclear crises, have demonstrated its ongoing relevance and importance. Following the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, E-6B aircraft were among the many military assets placed on heightened alert as the United States scrambled to understand the nature and scale of the threat. In subsequent years, as tensions with North Korea, Russia, and other nuclear-armed states have periodically risen, the E-6B fleet has been a visible and active component of America's nuclear readiness signaling. When multiple E-6B aircraft were tracked airborne over the continental United States simultaneously on various occasions in 2024, military analysts and open-source intelligence trackers noted the activity as a potential signal of elevated readiness or large-scale exercises. The aircraft regularly deploys to forward operating bases around the world. In August 2025, the Navy deployed E-6B aircraft to Greenland for the first time as part of Arctic defense operations. The Arctic is increasingly important from a military perspective, as the melting of polar ice opens new shipping routes and creates new strategic opportunities and vulnerabilities. An E-6B operating from Greenland can provide communications coverage across a vast area of the North Atlantic and Arctic regions, areas that are increasingly contested and increasingly important in the 21st century strategic environment. But the Looking Glass story is not standing still. The future of this extraordinary mission is in a period of genuine transition and uncertainty, and it is worth understanding what is coming and why it matters. The Navy has announced plans to replace the E-6B fleet with a new aircraft called the E-130J Phoenix II, derived from a Lockheed Martin C-130J-30 Super Hercules. The E-130J was officially named in October 2024 and is expected to begin entering service in fiscal year 2026. It will carry out the TACAMO mission, the submarine communication function. But there is a significant and somewhat troubling gap in the plan. The E-130J will not carry the airborne launch control system. It will not perform the Looking Glass function, the ability to command land-based ICBMs from the air. And the question of who assumes that responsibility is currently unresolved. The Air Force, which originally ran the Looking Glass mission from 1961 to 1998, is now being asked to consider taking it back. The National Defense Authorization legislation has included provisions pressing the Air Force to develop a strategy for maintaining the airborne command post capability, potentially using its own converted C-130J aircraft. The Air Force is simultaneously working on a successor to the E-4B National Airborne Operations Center, a separate but related aircraft used as the President's airborne command post. The successor program, called the Survivable Airborne Operations Center, is in development. The transition period between the E-6B and its successors will require careful management. The Looking Glass mission cannot be allowed to lapse. The submarine communication mission cannot be interrupted. These are, in the language of the military, no-fail missions, meaning that failure is not an acceptable outcome, that the resources and planning required to ensure continuity will be found regardless of cost or difficulty. Why does all of this matter? Why should you, sitting wherever you are right now, reading about or listening to a story about an airplane most people have never heard of, care about the Looking Glass? Here's why. The Looking Glass is not merely a piece of military hardware. It is a physical expression of a philosophical commitment. A commitment to the principle that the worst decision in human history, the decision to initiate a nuclear war, will never happen because of a failure of command and control. It is a commitment to ensuring that the American nuclear deterrent is always credible, always functional, always supervised by human beings with the authority and the training to use it wisely, or, far more importantly, to not use it at all. The greatest achievement of the Looking Glass in its 6 decades of existence is something that never happened. No nuclear war, no accidental launch, no moment when a general sitting in a circling aircraft had to make the most terrible decision a human being can make. More than 60 years of continuous readiness. More than 281,000 hours of flying just with the EC-135 fleet alone. And at the end of all of it, the world is still here. Still complicated, still dangerous, still imperfect, but still here. There's a moment that has always stayed with me when I think about the Looking Glass. In a Strategic Air and Space Museum in Ashland, Nebraska, there is a restored EC-135C Looking Glass aircraft on public display. Volunteers spent 6 years and more than 32,000 hours restoring it. They took an aircraft that had spent years deteriorating outside, its insulation rotted, its panels corroded, its instruments stripped, and they brought it back to life. They tagged and cataloged every component. They reinstalled every instrument from cockpit to tail. They gave back to history something that history deserved to remember. That aircraft, sitting in a museum in Nebraska, represents something extraordinary. It represents the people who flew the original missions, the generals who carried the weight of nuclear authority on their shoulders, the communications officers who kept the systems running, the navigators and pilots who circled for hours over the American heartland, watching and waiting. It represents a chapter of American military history that was almost entirely invisible to the public it was protecting. It represents the paradox of nuclear deterrence in its most distilled form. The preparation for a catastrophe carried out with extraordinary professionalism and dedication that helped ensure the catastrophe never came. The E-6B Mercury is today doing what the EC-135C did for 30 years before it. Somewhere right now, as you listen to these words, an E-6B is airborne. Its crew is at their stations. Its communication systems are active. Its airborne emergency action officer is sitting with a weight of nuclear authority on their shoulders, hoping, as every person who has ever sat in that seat has hoped, that today will be another ordinary day. That the phone will not ring with the call they have trained for. That the trailing wire antenna will not be needed for its ultimate purpose. That the world will remain complicated and imperfect and alive. They are up there right now. 22 people in a modified Boeing 707, circling above the clouds, watching, waiting, carrying the burden of civilization's last resort. You will never see them. You will never hear them. But they are there. And in a world of nuclear weapons, the fact that they are there, ready, capable, credible, and desperately hoping they never have to act, is one of the quiet, invisible pillars on which peace itself is built. The next time you look up at the sky and see a contrail streaking across the blue, think about this. That white line in the sky might just be a commercial flight, or it might be the Looking Glass, doing what it has been doing since 1961, watching over a world that does not know it is being watched, and hoping, always hoping, that this will be another day when nothing happens. Because in the strange, terrible, magnificent mathematics of nuclear deterrence, nothing happening is everything. So I want to ask you this, and I want you to really think about your answer. In a world where technology is advancing faster than our diplomacy, where new nuclear powers are emerging and old ones are modernizing their arsenals, where artificial intelligence is beginning to touch the edges of military decision-making, do you believe the looking glass? The idea of a single human being with nuclear authority in an aircraft above the clouds is still the right answer? Or has the time come to rethink the entire architecture of nuclear command and control from the ground up? Leave your answer in the comments. This is one of those questions where every perspective matters. If you found this story as extraordinary as I do, share it with someone who does not know this piece of history. And subscribe, because we have more stories exactly like this one. The hidden, the forgotten, the classified, and the extraordinary, waiting for you.